I'm now very pleased to introduce Alexander Vindman. He's a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army. In his most famous assignment, he served as the director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia on the National Security Council staff. Prior to retiring from the Army, he also served as a foreign area officer with assignments in Moscow, Russia, and for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a political military affairs officer. While in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he co-authored the National Military Strategy Russia Annex, and he's currently getting a PhD at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. We're really honored to have him with us today to talk about his book, and I now want to invite Mr. Vindman on stage to give some opening remarks. He and I will then have a moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Perry Worldhouse. Mike, thank you for having me join the team as a visiting fellow this past year. I'm very pleased to kind of end up my book tour. This is the second to last event here at Perry Worldhouse, where I think this was my the first engagement I agreed to in those opening days of August of 2020, just after I left the military. So thanks again. So I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about the book, Here Right Matters, what that phrase means and what the book is about. I wrote it for two reasons. I wrote it to explain the why a lieutenant colonel ended up in the public eye testifying in front of Congress, and how I managed to negotiate, or I think that's fair, negotiate what was a unprecedented series of events in which a lieutenant colonel found himself in opposition to the commander-in-chief. So the why, I think it's important to understand the context and how somebody ends up there, especially an Army officer. There's not a set path. You don't end up graduating between the ranks and positions to end up at the White House. It was a lengthy career. The capstone, to a certain extent, it was for me at least, of a 20-year military career, a decade as an infantry officer, proving myself as a leader and a troop leader, and then eventually as a foreign area officer, a political military advisor, a cultural and regional expert, and earning a position on the National Security Council. Mike mentioned some of those critical developmental assignments along the way. I started off as a FAO at about the 7 or 8 year mark as a military officer with a immersion into another language. I spoke Russian because of my heritage, so I picked up Ukrainian at the Defense Language Institute. I had a regional and cultural immersion, living a year in Ukraine and traveling throughout the former Soviet Union. I picked up an advanced degree at Harvard, a regional studies degree and international relations degree. And then I went straight to Moscow, which is kind of the World Series of attaché assignments, of diplomatic assignments, and spent 3 years there during a particularly interesting and fascinating moment in which the reset, as it was known, was failing, and we still had some sort of somewhat normal relationship, but it completely broke apart when the Russians attacked Ukraine, annexed Ukrainian territory, and in so doing, revealed their preferred means of achieving foreign policy outcomes with regards to coercion, military aggression, and I had a chance to see that unfold firsthand. That was a unique experience, and the White House, the Pentagon was recognizing that they made the hyper-focus on the global war on terror on the Middle East may have allowed our critical adversaries, our nation-state adversaries, to seize a moment, seize an opportunity, and fill a vacuum, a void to achieve their national security outcomes. So I arrived at the Pentagon in a moment where there was this reflection on what should we do with a resurgent Russia? What should we do with other regional actors, with the rising China? And I had a chance to author the military's strategy for facing Russia as an adversary. And then develop this, we in the military, these words are particularly meaningful, but a campaign to actually take the military forward for the next decade or so on how we were going to, what it was concretely that we're going to do with regards to Russia as a military and a hybrid warfare threat actor. And came to the attention of the White House, and that's really how I ended up in the White House as a expert on Russia. Ukraine was a fluke of history. It was only because I had studied Ukrainian almost a decade before or so. That was about a decade before that. That plus a vacancy in the National Security Council that I was asked to pick up Ukraine also. So that's could have played out very differently. So that's the why, explaining, why I was in that position. The other portion of the why I have a feeling we can get to, so I'll just briefly mention that the phone call wasn't the beginning and the end. It was a waypoint in President Trump's corrupt scheme to steal an election. We actually saw that in failing to do so with regards to a coercion campaign against Ukraine. We saw it play out over the remaining 16 months of office or so, in which the president believed he could cast a shadow over free and fair elections in the United States and tried to steal an election. But in the preceding months before the phone call, I had watched this enterprise unfold, in which some of you that follow this closely saw our U.S. ambassador to Ukraine removed from the position, recalled. All the rhetoric coming out of the closest proxies of President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, talk about this idea of Ukrainian corruption, Ukrainian interference in U.S. elections in 2016, and watching that slowly creep out from just a purely kind of rhetorical political maneuvering to an effect on U.S. policy, a hold on security assistance. I watched this all unfold with my own eyes, and being in a position to do something about it, I actually pulled it out of the shadows. I didn't allow it to be a kind of a tenuous hold by one marginal department or agency or a body within government that was looking to serve the president's interests and not fulfill its obligations to the Constitution, and pulled it into the national security apparatus and made sure that the departments and agencies that had a stake in U.S. national security could voice their concerns about what was going on and ultimately try to convince the administration to reverse course on its hold. Failing to do that, at the same time, unbeknownst to me, my report of the president's wrongdoing in a phone call resulted in Congress being notified of the president's abuse of power and conducting investigations. And ultimately, that's what compelled President Trump to lift a hold on security assistance. It also resulted in his impeachment. So again, that's the brief why. The how is really what the book is about. There's an obligatory obligation to talk about the phone call, to talk about my experiences around the impeachment, but really most of the story is about the key aspects of my background, the key aspects of reflecting, months after testimony, just after I left military service, reflecting on what it was that contributed to me doing what I thought was the right thing, but also in the right way. So I talk about my immigrant background, the fact that my family came to the United States when I was a young guy, 4 years old, a toddler, and the impact that had on me with regards to gifting me some greater perspective on how the U.S. was different, what authoritarianism is about, the decades of military service, serving in combat, serving in very difficult locations, at one point serving in Korea, right on the border on the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, seeing the stark contrast between democracy and capitalism and free markets and authoritarianism and communism, how that contributed combat what I learned from combat, that I could respond coolly and calmly, even under the most adverse of circumstances. I could be trained. You know, for those of you that read the book, that didn't seem to be where I started. I was hyper energetic and not focused as a young guy, having to overcome some of those as a late bloomer. And I talk about what I learned from the military in terms of values, which was something I'm very grateful for. I may be a little bit more vocal and critical of the shortcomings of the Department of Defense and the Army now, but it's from a place of love and a desire for the institution to get better and learn from its shortcomings. But I benefited immensely with just a fantastic, amazing career as a public servant, a career that empowered me with a series of tools to navigate very, very difficult challenges. And I talk about, the decisions I made with regards to reporting the phone call. They weren't that hard, especially the initial report. I was just doing what I thought was right and what I thought could potentially get the president to reverse course on his ill-considered hold on security assistance. We talk about the fact that the president was notoriously inconsistent, is maybe the kind way of saying it, with regards to making a policy pronouncement and then having to reverse course because it was poorly considered. That had happened behind doors many times, and using the proper, all the tools at my disposal to try to counsel the president, and then not being complicit with regards to covering up presidential wrongdoing. I discuss all of these things, and then I discuss the aftermath, what I learned, why I think in the United States, right matters. It's the title of the book here, Right Matters, that this country is different. It's not perfect, to be clear, but it's a unique place in the world. It has certainly holds the attention of the world with regards to a leader for democracy and for rights, in spite of recently tarnished track record. And I'm quite hopeful about the future, especially if we get people and young people to join the ranks of public servants. And we have some excellent public servants, and contribute to making this country, to moving this country forward, trying to move towards the more perfect union that our forefathers and founding fathers had aspired to when they established this country. So I think that's a good rundown. I'm not sure. I think that's about right. Stop there for questions.
All right. You spent some time talking about your personal background there, and the way that it shaped your perspective, your attitude, et cetera. Tell us a little more about how you made the decision to report the president's misconduct. I mean, the way you describe it, in some ways, it's almost matter of fact. Like you thought the president was doing something wrong, and so you reported it. But not just in the White House, but people face situations every day where maybe you see something wrong and maybe you don't say something. So how'd you make that call?
That's right. Well, there's that kind of poster of "see something, say something." We have our own version. We have our own version in the military. You make on-the-spot corrections. You're trained as a young officer to, if you see something wrong, you don't walk by, and you don't just let it go. I remember having a conversation with my rabbi at one point, and some famous lines from Rabbi Hillel, where he talks about, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? I think, without fully understanding it, I understood that the burden was on my shoulders. I was the official responsible. I had all the facts. I had watched over the course of months a slow creep of politics and corruption into what should have been a very direct and straightforward national security approach. I had already been on staff for the better part of 9 months before before some of this seepage of corruption started to come in. And in that time, my charge was to help support Ukraine's sovereignty and independence while they're in a state of war with Russia, an active state of war with Russia. And in so doing, I put together a couple of plans. It's what we do in the military. I put together a plan to secure Ukraine's elections in March of 2019. And then I also, once I saw the direction the country was moving in, that President Zelensky was going to be the incoming president, somebody that was in a lot of ways, not prepared, classically not prepared to be to take over the position of chief executive, maybe competent, maybe intelligent, but had not served in office. That I put together another plan about what is it we're going to do concretely with regards to Russia, and that was going to be something as simple as increased engagements between key leadership between the U.S. and Ukraine, economic cooperation, security cooperation, and I saw this plan that was put together and not approved just by me, but approved by deputy assistant secretaries. I convened meetings at the deputy assistant secretary level, and then I had Fiona Hill, my boss, convene at the assistant secretary level, and I saw I saw domestic politics start to creep in, and really by the time the phone call occurred on January 25th, I knew basically everything that was going on. The only piece of the puzzle that was missing was whether the president was behind it or not. It could have been just cronies. It could have been people looking to elevate themselves, ingratiate themselves, do the president a favor for something in return. But I couldn't quite convince myself that, in spite of watching a notoriously corrupt president, that it was the president that was behind it. Partially because I guess he's the commander in chief, and I needed kind of a smoking gun. The phone call was all it was to me was a smoking gun, and I reported on July 10th. So lower ranking officials party to this corruption, and all I did was follow through on the 25th. It was not that hard. I knew as soon as I heard the president. I mean, I didn't know beforehand. That was the interesting thing, because I was still hopeful, but when I heard the president say what he did, basically pressure the Ukrainians, I knew what I was going to do.
So you're in the military, and the president is the commander in chief, and you're trained to do what the commander in chief says. So how did you sort of reconcile the what is the right thing to do versus the decades of you must obey the commander in chief?
That's true, but military is also taught to that we're under no obligation to obey illegal orders. And while it wasn't absolutely clear to me whether this was an illegal order or not, I knew it was wrong. I also recognized that the president wasn't above the law.
Right, the military serves the Constitution.
Right, and I recognize that, in fact, that's one of the reasons. That's part of American exceptionalism, is that nobody's above the law. So just because he's president doesn't mean he can get away with illegal activity. The other part that I had rattling around in my brain is that, in fact, sometimes presidents do use coercion to achieve U.S. national security interests, but they're doing this in the service of U.S. national security interests. President Trump was not serving U.S. national security interests. He was actually harming national security interests. He was serving his own political interests. He perceived acutely in those days, and early in the campaign, that Vice President Biden was going to be his biggest threat, and he was responding to this threat. He was willing to go to any lengths. We learned, how far he's willing to go later with him supporting an insurrection. But at that point in time, he was willing to undermine free and fair elections.
So what do you think it meant for the country, I guess, and for you, that the Senate didn't remove Trump from office during his first impeachment trial, and how
were you ever optimistic that the outcome would be different, or did you sort of see the politics coming?
Well, I had pretty clear understanding. I tend to be, optimist, but I had a pretty clear understanding of what the outcomes were. I'm also a student of history. I know that parties don't vote against their president, and there was little chance of the Senate convicting President Trump. But really, again, if I dwelled on that, that could have been a reason to give, be a more reluctant witness, less forthcoming with my, factual accounts of what had happened, because for some reason that I was absorbing costs, but the Senate wasn't going to do that. I decided that was not really what I was going to do. Is I was going to do my job. I was going to focus in on the fact that I had a role. There were elected officials that had other roles, and I couldn't be responsible for how they would respond, but I could be responsible for myself and act in accordance with my duties and obligations. And ultimately, it's a pretty catastrophic situation that President Trump was acquitted, that we had a host of political officials that put their own personal interests ahead of their obligations to the Constitution, because the president believed he could act with impunity. In those going into the COVID pandemic, if he had even been censured, he may have been a little bit more cautious. Instead, he discounted the severity of the pandemic, and frankly, more than discounted, he denied it for a long period of time. And I think I believe the president and the Senate have blood on their hands, because if it was handled more effectively, we would not be at 700,000 American dead. And to me, that's probably the biggest catastrophe, is that we lost 700,000 lives because of politics.
Because of the way that President Trump was emboldened in dealing with COVID, because of the way
Right.
the impeachment trial.
I mean, I'm not saying that COVID would have not happened. It would have.
Yeah.
We would still have a catastrophe, a pandemic on our hands, but it wouldn't have been mismanaged in the same way. I don't think you could find anybody that could say that Vice President Pence, who had executive experience, governor of Indiana, would have handled COVID, the pandemic in the same way. He would have been far more effective than a president that didn't know any more on his last day in office than he did on his first day in office.
So that's a great line. What lessons can we learn, do you think, from your experience, and that whether one, and let me ask this at the individual level and sort of at the national level, and that I mean, you were focused in some ways on reporting what you thought about as misconduct. And we, in lots of workplaces, including the White House, have systems essentially for reporting that misconduct. So has your experience convinced you that these kinds of mechanisms, work as intended, or do we need to strengthen these mechanisms sort of in the government? And what kind of lessons might that have for, people not making, working on national, really important national security decisions, and working on really important stuff at their own workplace?
Right. So I think that the institutional stuff, I'll get to in a second, but I think I would hope that people will take away this notion that individuals can make a difference. I think that should be an example that, in my case, my report forestalled the president stealing an election. That's pretty impactful, I hope, and that should be a source of encouragement for people that are questioning whether a firm moral position, an ethical position that even has personal costs, is something that's warranted, because it can be impactful. I'd like to tell there's an interesting counterfactual that I wish I had in my interview with Susan Page beforehand, but before I wrote the book. But she asked me this idea: what would have happened if I didn't report the phone call?
He's now telling me a question I should have asked but didn't ask.
Yeah.
Just to be clear.
But it's no, I'm
just kidding.
Okay, we'll take that.
Answer Susan's question.
Yeah. But the question, it was really thought-provoking, because I would have been a colonel. I would have graduated senior service college, war college, been in a place of significant importance to U.S. national security. But at the same time, we might have, honestly, there's a good chance we could have ended up with President Trump in the second term. The way I could justify this, and this is not a leap of logic. We were 2 days away from President Trump realizing his corrupt scheme. President Zelensky had a interview scheduled with Fareed Zakaria on September 13th. It was canceled on September 11th because 3 congressional committees launched an investigation into the president's abuse of power and his hold on security systems. If that President Trump realized his scheme and had the Ukrainians launch their investigation, President Biden would have been damaged going into primary season. He may have not been the nominee, and the President Trump running against a different candidate may have been successful. So it's pretty amazing. I mean, that's a lot of like guessing, but to me, that's at least it helps me rationalize the costs for me. Now, with regards to institutions, whether those are in the commercial space or in the public space, I don't think our institutions are protect whistleblowers or encourage people to speak their mind. I think the costs tend to be quite high, create an enormous amount of tumult in people in whistleblowers' lives, and there are insufficient protections to ease any of those shocks. I think that what I would hope to see is whistleblower protection strengthened and civil society take an interest in this space. There are already organizations that seek to support provide legal support, so attorneys' fees and things of that nature. But it's more than that. I mean, that's only that maybe is a shock absorber to a high cost of legal representation. There are other costs that, what about the end of a job or end of a career? So, some sort of support to help people transition. I did okay. I had a very robust network of folks. I could call you, Mike, and and land at Perry Worldhouse as a visiting fellow, or go to Johns Hopkins as a doctoral candidate because I had a good track record and a good number of connections. But plenty of people don't have that.
Sure.
So I'd like to see those strengthened.
Absolutely. So one more question for me, and then we're going to open up to the audience, which is my way of saying, if you have a question, then the microphone is over there. Please step up and try to give your colleagues distance also as you sort of get in line to ask a question. And that's I can't let you out of this part of the conversation without asking something about substance. After all, you were on the NSC staff because of your expertise in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and so tell us a little bit, teach us a little bit in some ways about what the 2-minute version, not the hour-long version of what Russia's goals in the world are and how they sought to work in the Trump administration to achieve their goals.
Sure. This is I could give lengthy remarks on Russia, but well, I think Putin has himself said that Russia has not been served by the international system, by the international order, and having in his conception not being served by the international order, he's prepared to upend it. That's his paraphrasing his own words. And frankly, that's why when people ask me about what are our most significant national security threats, I talk about Russia. I talk about Russia because it has the capabilities and it has the intent. China also has the capabilities, but potentially lacks the intent to upend the system. In the case of, and they're not like items in that Russia has a large security apparatus and defense apparatus willing to use its much smaller economic element of power to coerce and enable illicit finance networks. China is a behemoth on the economic front, closer to at parity roughly on the military front. But the difference is Russia has demonstrated its willingness to use hybrid warfare, to use military aggression to achieve its aims, to break the international system.
Like
And
the invasion of Crimea, invasion of Georgia.
Yes, and I think they're prepared to even be probably more experimental because they believe that they can thrive in chaos. They believe that that Russia could become a pole, not just because it's coherent and powerful, but because the neighbors are weaker, other poles are weaker. China, on the other hand, has been served by the international system in a lot of ways. And the question might be right now is whether it's squeezing more out of the international system, or does it really want to change it? And I think that there's some ambiguity, and that's why I could say for the next 3 to 5 years, Russia is by far the biggest threat adversary. In the lack of response to Russian aggression and malign influence, they're emboldened, just like Trump was with regards to corruption and trying to steal an election. The Russians are emboldened in their ability to use hybrid warfare. They haven't suffered a cost. They haven't been denied the benefit. And I think as the Biden administration recognizes that there is not a soft approach to Russia, that more muscular response is required. There's a mismatch between Russia's expectations that could get away with something and the reality that it can't. And that's a recipe for I don't want to overstate it. That's not a recipe for war, but it's a recipe for a much more acute relationship. And we have a lot of work to do on the deterrence front.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. And now I want to open up to the audience, and we'll kind of go back and forth, I think, between some of our virtual guests that have been asking questions and people here. And when you please introduce yourself for asking your question.
Hi, so I'm Sam Kaufman. I am a senior studying bio here in the college. If you'll humor me, I have a comment that sort of leads into a question, which is, so I was born in 1999, which means I was a toddler when 9/11 happened and the Patriot Act was passed. And so I think a lot of people of my generation don't have the same horror that people of my parents' generation do at the decline of American democracy. We kind of take it as a given, we kind of accept it. And so maybe you don't like to hear that, but for those of us who want to, take our privilege and use it to do something good, to serve the common good, the public good, what are your thoughts on doing that, going into a world where we cannot be nearly as sure what I'll say this delicately, what the regime type is going to be?
Well, I would, first of all, I guess I would dispute this notion that the U.S. is, and I'm not sure, I don't think this is quite what you're saying, but I just want to make sure it's clear that while the U.S. doesn't hold the same power it did in the post-World War II period, relatively speaking, it's still the most important international player, the most potent force in the world, and the most potent force in the world for good, frankly, because if not us, then who? I think, we've somewhat experienced what happens when the U.S., when there's a vacuum and the U.S. is distracted. Part of my contention is that the hyper-focus on the global war on terror allowed other powers to seize the initiative and advance alternative theories and alternative visions of the world. And I think the U.S. must step in to fill those roles. There are anecdotal examples of the U.S. withdrawing from various committees in the United Nations, only to have those voids filled by Russia's and China's. So I think it kind of depends on what kind of world we want to live in. If we want to live in a world where there's a pluralistic notion of prosperity, and that you don't need weaker powers around you in order to flourish, like Russia, like China. We want to live in a world where we think that through prosperity, everyone benefits. This whole idea of rising tide lifts all boats. Then the U.S. has to play a role, because again, if it's not us, then there's nobody to fill that role. Now that doesn't mean that we could lead in the same kind of patriarchal way that we may have done in the past when there was this kind of brief unipolar moment. it means that we probably need to recognize that that we need contributions, and I'm not talking about resource contributions. We just need other democracies to step in and be part of play a role in resisting the rise of authoritarianism, to hardening existing democracies, supporting struggling democracies, and advocating for democratic values. And I think the U.S. still has a leadership role. I kind of envision this idea of a round table, and the U.S. has a seat at that round table and a voice, but it's part. I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs about the marshaling democracies. And this, I think, we'll see some of that. We'll see how some of that plays out with President Biden's Democracy Summit here in the near term. Thank you for that question.
So a question from our online audience goes back to the phone call and says, you reported the phone call in principle. How did you assess the odds of the various possible outcomes from your decisions? You said before that you were trying to hopefully encourage a better U.S. policy.
Mhm.
But you also said that by the time the phone call occurred, like you kind of knew what was up. So how were you thinking, as a professor, I'd say, down the game tree?
Yeah.
when you reported the phone call?
Sure. So the same time the phone call occurred on the 25th. On the 26th, I had a deputies committee scheduled. So these were parallel tracks. The political and engagement and diplomatic track was an opportunity to potentially allow President Zelensky, who is notoriously charming, he's a comedian, and knows how to read the room, to be charismatic and engage with President Trump and help normalize. But on the other track, that week was a very, very busy week. I had on Monday and Wednesday, I had PCCs, I think, and then a DC on a Friday. And so this is assistant secretary level meetings that I'm basically putting together that background.
By the way, for the students, that's like government speak for like a midterm every day of the week.
Yeah. And then final at the end of the week.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty busy week, and I was at the same time as I was trying to, I could have probably not recommended this phone call, but that would have been, I felt like that would be a disservice. A country in my portfolio requested a phone call. They had a very important election, the first time that a party in Ukraine had won a majority in the parliament, their Duma, and under normal circumstances, they should have a phone call, their key partner. So I recommended it. Ambassador Bolton killed it. He didn't think it was a good idea because he perceived the risks. It actually fell off the plate, and it came back on mysteriously a couple of days later, well after these phone calls typically land, because there were schemes behind the scenes. So that was on the one hand. The other hand, I was doing these meetings and building consensus amongst the entirety of senior leadership in the U.S. government about what our policies should be. So I wasn't just relying on one thing or the other. I was basically working in parallel. I used every single tool I had at my disposal to try to right the ship.
Thank you. Next up.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Rebecca Carlson. I'm a graduate student. First of all, thank you for your service. My dad was in the military for 22 years, so I always have a special place in my heart
Thank you.
for military. So I watched every second of those hearings. I was just blown away by so many of your testimonies, especially yours and Ambassador Yovanovitch. Just truly unbelievable in terms of your experience, your wealth of knowledge, and all that you brought to the jobs that you were in. How did you deal with the aftermath of just the onslaught of the character, all the characterization attacks on you and your fellow people in the jobs, and just kind of the overwhelming negativity that you guys must have been dealing with in trying to do the right thing?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. I think I think there were a couple of factors that helped. First of all, back to this idea of perspective, that I'd been through some very, very challenging assignments tragedies in my personal life that put this issue in perspectives. And whereas, on the one hand, the president and his cronies were disseminating attack talking points to the right-wing media, they did this ham-handedly. They didn't just send it to Fox News and OANN. They sent it to independent media, so it's part of the public record now that they sent out attack talking points on me. But I didn't really dwell on those. I felt first implicitly and then explicitly support from the American public. I witnessed it when at one point my synagogue offered to pass letters of support, and I said, sure. I didn't really understand what that meant, but a couple of letters, and then I ended up getting several thousand letters from folks and people reaching out, passing support. So I knew that was out there on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was people in the media, like talking heads that I didn't really have a high regard for anyway, or the administration seeking to undermine my credibility, attack my character. The biggest issue that I really had to deal with is that although I could in one way shrug it off because it wasn't important, it was critically important to my career. Because when you had, I was an attaché, working for the Defense Intelligence Agency or in overseas assignments, those assignments were no longer viable for me. I couldn't serve in those capacities. I would be vulnerable from one perspective. So that's really the biggest cost, is that it kind of killed my career. And then I think there was my wife, who's in charge of safety. I'm in charge of fun, according to my daughter. She felt the kind of personal security risks more acutely than I did. But we had a strong family. My twin brother, who was at the NSC with me, he was right there with me the whole time. He lives 4 doors down from me, so I had that network. I had my friends and family and supporters, and on balance, it was stressful, but it was manageable.
So another question from our online audience asks, it's been said you get the leaders in the government you deserve as a country. From your perspective, what does that say about the United States, and what can we, the people, do better?
I think what that says is that there are some fundamental issues that we have to deal with. I don't think the people that vote for President Trump want our country to fail. They don't want our country to suffer, but he appeals to his voters in that he addresses their grievances. They believe that he's the one that's going to solve their problems. And it's unfortunate because he's deceitful and he's lying, but that's what that's some people suggest that maybe they don't want that. They want they just want to maintain their striation in some sort of hierarchy. I don't know. The American people that I meet, and I've been out and about quite a bit, they want good for this country, even if they're on the other side of the aisle. They just believe they're responding to something. They're responding to lies. They believe that, how is it that the president of the United States could be only serving his own interests? So what I think is that we need elected officials that are actually going to live up to their obligations. And we need an engaged electorate that is not apathetic, isn't complacent. Those are two different things. I think complacency is the way I describe our electorate a decade ago, where they didn't have to really worry about where the country was going to be. It survived for 240 years. It was going to be there. Now it's apathy because they don't think that they could do anything, and they don't think they can make a difference. We need an engaged electorate that actually is prepared to hold elected officials that fall short accountable. That's probably the biggest thing. That's the biggest, maybe the biggest short-term prescription here is accountability. And then we need good ideas. So if we can start holding folks accountable, voting for folks out of office, then we need to look for folks that have better ideas on how to fix this country. There are some fundamental issues, I think, that stem to, that could be tied back to insufficient opportunities for, large swaths of the American population due to not being properly tooled for the 21st century.
Great.
Hi, my name is Leah. Thank you so much for joining us today. I was really interested in what you said about taking the words from your rabbi and using them to inform a really difficult decision that you were making at the time. And I was curious if that's something that comes up a lot for you throughout your career, if you often use religion to inform decisions, or if you ever find a conflict maybe between your religious identity and career decision.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm engaged in my synagogue. I got a 10-and-a-half-year-old that's moving towards a bat mitzvah, and I'm very keen on her having an identity and making some choices about who she wants to be when she gets older. But having the tools and having that background, I don't know if this is something that I can frankly struggle with. As I'm not sure how much of my Jewish identity was important. I know that it's something that I embrace, but I tend to not be too spiritual. It's always somewhere. It's always there, kind of a foundation of sorts. This is an insufficient answer because I don't have an answer for myself.
Is this more like I suffered through Hebrew school, so my children will suffer?
No, there's like something of that nature, but I think there's something more about. I think it's an underlying ethic and value that I share, but I just tend not to be. I tend not to be spiritual. I tend to be relatively practical in that regard. My wife is more on kind of the spiritual side, keeps us on the straight and narrow.
Not that that says anything about my own experiences in Hebrew school.
Yeah.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and the next question's from our online audience, and goes back again to the phone call, and asking, if you, and this is a different version of the counterfactual in some ways. The counterfactual you talked about before was about you and what would have happened to your career. If you hadn't reported the phone call, do you think somebody else would have?
People are just walking out. Wow.
I know, and people
It's my cousin. That's okay. Sorry.
I mean, it's just so inconsiderate.
Yeah. No, she gets a pass. All right. Sorry.
Counterfactual. If
Yeah.
you hadn't reported the phone call, would somebody else who heard the phone call have reported it?
I don't know. There were other people in the room, and another person reported the phone call, but really more as a CYA, to
Right.
protect themselves. I don't think if I didn't report it, nobody would have reported it probably.
So the last question then, or actually, if we have a question here,
Hi, my name is David Israel. I have a question. I'd like to take it back to the military. I am retired from the military. So my question was, I understand your brother, or at least in reading, your brother was also affected by this. And that's the part that bothers me the most. How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, I think he was affected, and he remains affected by it. I think part of it's easily attributed to a notoriously vindictive presidential administration. We would joke about like Friday, firing parties and stuff like that. He's going to get fired. So there's no chance. I mean, it wasn't a complete shock that he was going to be fired. I walked out of there not holding anything. He was also prepared to be walked out of there. But it's really the part that's most troubling is that the military, an institution that I love and respect, that's filled with folks like myself, exceptional public servants, in my estimate, kind of fell short on its obligations to live up to the values. and it failed to do so in my own experience, and it failed to live up to my for my twin brother also, who's, you know, he's encountered some of the same stigma just because the military doesn't quite know what to do with an officer now that, you know, has a public persona, public presence, and they don't look kindly on that, even though we did the right thing in the right way.
Well, it was the piece about your brother more than, I understand where the pressure would be on you,
Yeah.
but I would think that there would be some insulation for your brother, and that's disturbing.
Yeah.
And
Well,
he was in a different service, was he not?
he's Army. His problem is that he looks like me.
Oh.
He's my twin brother. So he's 9 minutes younger, so he's, you know, he doesn't have that wisdom and sophistication. But you know, but yeah, that's kind of the issue. You know, and I pulled him into this whole thing by dragging him in to be a witness to my report also.
Well, sibling rivalry for the win. And thank you for the important words and thoughts. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And I hope that you will join us next Tuesday for The World Today for a conversation with Ted Johnson on his book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. And as always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel. You can stay connected with Perry Worldhouse by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Perry Worldhouse. And thanks again to everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.